Hello.
Hello, welcome to our last lecture for this semester. We are very happy to have Nicholas Zembashi from Forensic Architecture here today.
Hi.
Hello.
How are you doing? Did you enjoy the intro? Intro by SOFIRE. Come please show yourself. Yeah. She's doing afterwards a little musical performance, so please stay
tuned.
Stay tuned. Okay. And let's start with your lecture right away.
So, hi everyone, my name is Nicholas Zembashi. I am a researcher at Forensic Architecture here in London at Goldsmiths University. If we play the first video.
Oh, sorry, we messed up. I think people couldn't hear you, so.
Okay, I can go again.
Yeah, okay, let's start right now.
Great. Okay. Hi everyone, my name is Nicholas Zembashi. I'm a researcher at Forensic Architecture here in London. We're a research agency based at Goldsmiths University, and we are a multidisciplinary group comprised of architects, artists, software developers, coders, lawyers, and archaeologists. We use essentially spatial tools to develop new research methodologies that help investigate cases of human rights violations. So what you should be seeing on the screen is just a taster from our website with some of the investigations that we've been working on. And today I'll take you through some that I've personally worked on since my time at Forensic Architecture. But before that, just to warn everyone, of course, some of the footage and some of the media that I'll be showing does contain graphic content. Most of it is blurred and edited, but some of it might be distressing or uncomfortable, so I just warn you now. And also there's a segment on machine learning that might have some flashing imagery, just as a warning as well. So if there's a core theme I'd like us to unpick, and it is generally expanding our ways of seeing, and in doing so finding a commons for agency in the space where we cannot see, so finding agency in counter perspectives. And these are kind of like running themes that I'd like to focus on throughout the investigations I'll take you through. So the idea of time can be reduced to a point of view. Duration is made of transitory instances, just as a straight line is made of points without depth. Events come to us piecemeal through fragments of media, and events are spread across points in time, essentially, diffracted by camera lenses, testimonial memory, pixels, and all such sensory barriers. And these create thresholds of detectability. And the question that we often ask ourselves with every project tool that we use is, can we use them in order to detect beyond these thresholds? And very often when we talk about these thresholds, when we talk about sort of these points in which we want to investigate, a lot of the work deals with gaps and identifying gaps. So what I mean by gaps, so gaps in vision, literally gaps in information and in footage. What I'm about to show you here is the case of Zach Kostopoulos, an LGBTQI activist who was killed in central Athens on September 21st, 2018. Just a short introduction to the case. Zach was lynched twice, first by two men and shortly after by several policemen. And this was in broad daylight in a busy, on a busy afternoon on a pedestrian street full of coffee shops and restaurants with dozens of onlookers. The clip you're about to see in the video that will follow, so if we can start playing the video, please, This clip was the main clip that captured the moment of the first lynching. And the first 3 minutes of the clip on the left-hand side that you will see in portrait mode, that's the original clip that both us and the lawyers of the family had access to. The clip on the right-hand side is an edited version of that clip that appeared on the media. And after synchronizing, so you see the bars as the time is going through, you see moments where the heavily edited version starts syncing up with the original. What we discovered was that after a certain point, the clip in the media actually continues on, and we realized that there were actually gaps in this like key piece of footage that didn't allow us to see a lot of what happened after, and we can only see it in fragments whenever it appeared. And even up to this day, this piece of footage is withheld, despite sort of like pressures by legal teams and pressures from us on the investigatory authorities to obtain this. So so what we had to do, and what we generally, so if we can move back to the presentation, sorry, in case the clip didn't finish. But what we generally do then is sort of one of the key points of our methodologies around a lot of projects, especially when we have these fragmented kind of like ways of engaging with media, is finding and identifying these gaps by synchronizing and seeing where there's gaps in our access to the event itself. And so if we can play clip number 3, please. 3, yes. So by gathering all the clips that we had available to us, we started, so more than the clip that we just saw, we started looking until we spotted a common thread. A man in a yellow t-shirt who had never testified and could have been a key witness. His identifying shirt, patches in his jeans, wristwatch and trainers. These were all sort of common observations that we used to verify across all the pieces of media that it was indeed this man that we were seeing. So we made these observations while organizing and analyzing the footage in time. And if we imagine each clip, I think as you will start seeing now in the video, each clip is a durational bar that we can generate using a slit scan technique. So what you see like generated as a bar comes is taking a vertical line of pixels that equates a frame in time. So each bar corresponds to the length in time of that video. And we did this to all of the videos in order to add them to a timeline. And we formed a timeline and synchronized them. And you'll see zooming into a policeman's wristwatch, that was a moment as well that allowed us to verify the exact sort of within a minute of that clip and synchronize a lot of the other clips as well across our timeline. And that was from the second, that was from footage from the second beating. So these sparse clips reveal the gaps in time, but gaps are also spatial. And as you'll see, once we undistort the footage and it's matched within space, it's matched inside it's photo matched inside a 3D model that we construct, as we treat architecture as a silent, ever-present witness, because essentially the space forms a common ground for the event that took place. And through this spatial and temporal understanding combined, we can enter the event not only through footage available, but also to reveal gaps that extend beyond vision, and also are supplemented by spatial gaps in resolution and in time. And if we could fast forward the video, I'm not sure if it's at like 2 minutes and 37 seconds in the clip, please. So eventually there, by doing this process, we also spotted that not only had this man been present in every piece of footage, he was also close to the group of policemen when they were trying to apprehend Zach and like pushing him on the floor and like essentially lynching him and beating him for a second time. And he was holding a police baton, as you will see, that's similar with the retractable batons that the officers around him were holding. So this is just to say that essentially there was enough evidence here to make us ask another question, which was, what was this man doing? If he was a key witness, how come he was never called in by the investigative authorities to testify? So if the clip has just finished playing. Yes, great. Back to the presentation. So just a quick recap from like the time code and the synchronization to the architectural model. What all of this allowed us to do, before we go back to the conclusion at this point, is that we essentially use different elements, as you can see here, with the matching and through the architecture to resolve sort of questions of distance and time within those gaps. So something that was important as well methodologically is, if you notice, we modeled the street in quite a lot of detail down to the tiling that provided us with sort of a 50 centimeter, which was like approximately the size of a tile, sort of a degree of accuracy to positioning figures and also estimating distance. And this is where the space becomes really important in all investigations, is because then distance also allows you to calculate sort of like how fast people are walking, and especially when you spot someone in one clip, you can spot them in the other, and then suddenly synchronization becomes possible. And sort of looking at the fragments in isolation is where you think it's problematic when you don't have enough, but bringing them together is part of that process. So in the end, by placing and mapping all of these things and finding finding this these common sort of like elements between them, especially of this key witness, we were able to unlock sort of other points of view essentially within the case, where initially they seemed very narrow, and they still are, because unfortunately with this case there was still quite a lack of evidence in terms of like understanding what led to the lynchings, but what is clear is that something happened prior that triggered Zach to be looking for help. And from the moment when he was trying to enter a certain store, this man who was present prevented him from entering in it, and then he ended up, again, we don't have evidence for how, locked up in the jewelry store in that enclosure where you saw that video clip, where these two men were lynching him, one of them the shop owner, and this spiraled. Basically the narrative was being spun as these things were unfolding, at which the police were on the scene, following reports of a robbery, even though those were all discounted later on when it was found out and when more of the evidence emerged. But this is something to keep in mind when we go further in the other investigations, how from the very moment on the ground, even the narrative as well shifts very quickly and very drastically. And what we see here is basically us plotting what you saw in the film and in the exhibition context, where by cross-verifying the fragments, it allowed us to find the common thread and push for a public call for evidence, since the investigative authorities weren't responding to questions around bringing this witness in or searching for this witness. And the moment we uploaded a platform to call for evidence and for the members of the public to respond with more footage, essentially, and within 2 days, this was enough pressure to basically bring about that witness, the man in the yellow T-shirt, to testify. And this showed how civic society responds quite quickly when the question is quite sharp. And what this project shows is that even with so many little fragments of information, there's still sort of commonalities and like other things that can be established when things are viewed in unison. So conclusively, the gaps in evidence themselves and how we can establish the patterns to recognize these commonalities is what we use as ways to designate different ways of seeing what is missing. But all designation must be accomplished by means of certain relation to all other possible designations. To know what properly appertains to one individual event, point, object is to have before one classification, or the possibility of classifying all others. So what Foucault essentially mentions there is that classification, or our ability to create these patterns of relationships when we observe bits of information, leads us to, it requires correlation and correlation of evidence. So this leads us to the next investigation, if we could play clip 4. So what you see here is basically an entire case. It's a case it's a project we worked on in Eastern Ukraine called the Battle of Ilovaisk, and it focused around a battle in 2014 during the conflict, the height of the conflict in Eastern Ukraine. And the focal point for us and our collaborators was presenting evidence of Russian. So our collaborators contracted us to as part of a legal case. They were a team of lawyers that were working on a legal case for the European Court of Human Rights, and they wanted to submit evidence and gather evidence of Russian presence in Eastern Ukraine. Of course, this was an operation this was a very long court process that is still ongoing. And here what you see is like over 200 rows of information and some linking to hundreds of hours of video footage. And one of the questions is how could you analyze and even comprehend all of this? Because in comparison to what the first investigation I just showed you, this is the polar opposite, essentially. It's when you have an overabundance of information. And our brief here was twofold. If we're back in the presentation, it was to consolidate all existing evidence of Russian presence and visualize them in an accessible and interactive way. And the second part of it was also to develop research methodologies to uncover even more evidence, or to try and analyze the overabundance of evidence. So as part of the consolidation and visualization, we developed a tool that's open sourced, an open source code that we call Time Map. And you'll see it now in the next video, clip number 5. Where we managed to map on the ground over 130 events and organize them also along a timeline where you can filter by timescales and tags, and all their primary sources are documented and linked to where they are found. So the events also act as points of information that reference all of the open source evidence that exists online, but we managed to consolidate here. So it is not merely enough to establish gaps in the kind of work that we do. Especially in this project, the problem becomes noise, or finding ways to cross-verify all of these points to find, like we did before, the common threads, but in this case with such a non-linear kind of arrangement of evidence that is across different times in a conflict that stretches across a large kind of geopolitical scale. It is a tougher task of sense making. So basically, the equivalent of the man in the yellow t-shirt here becomes a needle in a haystack of information that needs to be found. And the needles that we were looking for were essentially military vehicles. They became very important evidentiary objects of interest, especially a particular type of tank, the T-72B3 model, that was known to be exclusively used by the Russian military at the time of the conflict, and therefore would have been quite concrete evidence of Russian presence. So this is kind of us establishing a method of what is it to look, or establishing a research question as well, and a path to accountability. But following the second point of the brief that I mentioned, which was the development of new tools, this is when machine learning classifiers became a way for us to hone into objects that we were searching for. And machines essentially are trained, can be trained to find objects of interest in images by basically identifying a region of pixels where they can, what machine learning classifiers essentially do is that they're very good at predicting the likelihood of an object appearing over an area of pixels by finding relationships. So deep neural nets, which is another name that refers to sort of the process of the machine learning classification itself, essentially assign values to every pixel in an image. They readjust this through computation, and they gain confidence in finding common patterns between these pixels. And this is how they get trained. A bit like if, say, you want to teach a child what an apple is, and you have a set of images that you've taken of apples and you start showing them apples, then hopefully once they've seen enough, when you show them an image that they've not seen before that has an apple in a completely different context, then they'll recognize hopefully what it is. And that essentially is as sort of rudimentary as it sounds as an explanation, what the machine does through computation. And in an even more abstract way, so what we see here is quite an abstract 2D diagram that's plotted by a pre-trained classifier that we used, and I'll show you how we used it in a second. But what a pre-trained classifier is, essentially, it means that it was already trained. It was already a child that has been shown loads of images of apples, not by us, by someone else, and it was ready to be questioned and asked, like to find more. This classifier was already trained on thousands of categories of images that were labeled by humans laboriously. It's quite a well-known data set called ImageNet in the machine learning community that was used, and we used this classifier and adapted it because it included generic labels such as military vehicles and tanks. What you see here is essentially what these classifiers are good at doing, because they're also not great at a lot of things, but they're very good at correlating points and creating those common relationships, grouping things by the mathematical kind of values that they're trained to learn. And if you take the color of each point is basically a piece of image of extracted from footage or photographs, and the red images are what are tanks, and the blue images is everything that isn't tank. But you see how it groups tanks in a cluster, and how all these other clusters, almost like an archipelago of like regions, are created with the blue areas where it finds relationships. We don't know what those relationships are, and this is where actually which is a point that I'll come to later on, but this is where actually these classifiers could be dangerous, or is what we refer to as, and you might have heard this term, the black box of machine learning classifiers. And the black box essentially refers to the fact that even people who code these classifiers don't know what the computations, don't know how a classifier decides to group certain things, and each classifier varies, and it's inherent with kind of the biases of like how the tool is constructed. But we'll get to that later on. So don't worry about anything beyond sort of this diagram, but what you need to understand is how it obviously is a good tool at correlating information. And exactly going from that, we wanted to take the task of accountability away from the classifier for now because of the issues of bias that I kind of touched on at the end there. But let's focus now on the fact that it's limiting its use to its correlative power. So if we play clip number 6, so we did this by triaging the web for videos of interest in the area and dates that we were looking for in Ilovice. And by deploying a pre-trained classifier already trained in recognizing thousands of labels of objects, we were able to identify military vehicles where it could. And we noticed that tanks kept recurring in those footage, in those pieces of footage, specifically the T-72B3 model. So what the classifier becomes as a powerful correlator of kind of like information, it becomes a prosthetic lens to the researcher's eye. And what you should be seeing now is if it scans through frames of images through a video and a bar, then it could return those results to the researcher in the form of a list of all the videos that it goes through. And then it can provide these confidence scores as sort of red highlights. And this way, both human and machine researcher can work together in like sieving through the overabundance of information that we're faced with, and reduce the task that is researching for an object of interest in so much information. So what this entire methodology, so if we're back to the presentation, what this entire methodology tells us about how we mediate between gaps and indeed how to construct counter perspectives is that here we needed to find a comprehensive way of identifying a common thread of evidence, the man in the yellow t-shirt or the T-72B3 tank. the difference being is here that we could get quite easily lost. So in a similar way, if we play clip number 7, that we created or we established kind of like common threads through cross verification, which is the technique that I've been showing even in the earlier investigation, which is like cross verifying all of the bits of information together to find these common threads. This is essentially what we were able to do on the platform here when we visualized the information as well, and when this also was submitted as an evidentiary device to the court, is that you can see these threads, these narrative threads in what we call narrative mode, that linked points of events that in isolation would have otherwise not been treated as having relations to others as easily. This is the first time that you can appreciate sort of on a geopolitical scale the degree of like a nation's sovereignty being infringed by another's covertly, which is something which is a human rights violations, which is very difficult essentially to visualize. And this is what we attempted to do with these tools and with this research methodology. So this was indeed a perspective or a point of view that was not accessible beforehand, and we started forming these constellations and these narrative threads. So back to the presentation, and if we could play, sorry, clip number 8, the tank as a common thread and as a narrative can be seen here, where we modeled the object as well to also show through other verification videos that we made how in one narrative instance that we were able to discover, certain images and clips of a T-72B3 tank actually proved to be the same tank driven by different members of the conflict who had captured it or found it damaged at different instances. And we verified it through the damage markings, by matching it to a 3D model that we constructed from the images. So again, how kind of the architecture of an object as well comes into play. And to return back to this very abstract diagram, like with any lens, any tool that mediates vision, the gaps are the second and most crucial process of our methodological approaches. And the gaps in sort of investigating a case also pertain to issues with the tool itself. And thresholds of understanding of that tool. So how a lens can also distort, say, a camera and change the way that you look through it. So does the code for a machine learning classifier, and what we referred to earlier as the black box and the way that it infers. So the process in which these correlations are made, where is being quite abstract and unknown to us, often creates these issues where bias simmers to the top. And what I mean by bias is that if someone has to go through footage to label it, someone has to code this algorithm, there's always unexpected or even sort of inherent human biases that will always simmer through the machine. And the problem is that we often inherently want to treat computation due to the mathematical process as some kind of logic that is objective. But quite the contrary, none of these logics are objective in the same way that a lens is never objective. So if, say you're flying, and this is where causation comes into play, and when correlation is used as causation, where if you imagine someone sitting in a booth operating a drone, which has a classifier that detects threat, the moment the threat is detected, that person can press a button to shoot. And that's when there's also that is the danger of short-circuiting the ability to make calculated judgments. And that's why it was important for us to understand and make this distinction between patterns of relationships and inference, and the fact that essentially classifiers suck at us understanding how they infer things, because that's not what they're it's totally internalized within the computational process, and that's where the biases come in. So how can we fill these kind of gaps in a classifier? How can we interrogate the tool itself? So if we think of machine vision as a kind of lens through which objects being captured are also diffracted and distorted, instruments of measurement and perception always come with inbuilt aberrations, in the same way that lenses of microscopes and telescopes are never perfectly curvilinear and smooth. the logical lenses of machine learning embody faults and biases. To understand machine learning and register its impact on society is to study the degree by which social data are diffracted and distorted by these lenses. So by looking at how an object, or how kind of like the thing that we're looking for gets distorted, was an important starting point for us to start investigating through an object of interest how a machine understands where an object is, and potentially highlight the issue of the problematics of the tool. And this brings us to like a wider methodological approach that we have, that part of our mandate in our human rights investigations is not only about like the case itself. It's not only about the evidence of the tanks in Ukraine. It was also about shifting that lens and looking back at the tool itself and investigating the classifiers that we were working with as well. So we wanted to find ways to improve machine learning between machine and human researchers in the context of human rights, and to interrogate the black box. So a way to do this is that we started delving into was in the use of synthetic data. So what is synthetic data? What you see is essentially an attempt at a photorealistic rendering of the 3D model of the tank in the image. So in order for the classifier to learn what it has to look for in the haystack of information, it needs a lot of images. But what if I wanted to train a classifier anew that only knows generic tanks, but I might want to train it to specifically look for T-72 tanks? But maybe there's not enough, you could have a data set of 150 images, say, but that might not be anywhere near enough images to show the machine to learn from. And the two key things about training machines and machine vision, which kind of also maybe works for human cognition as well, but like we're probably a bit better, but we also have the same problems with bias that we'll come to. Correlation works well when the classifier has been trained on bigger and more varied data sets. So the more images you have, then you can supplement more images by rendering synthetic images when you don't have enough. So this is what we'll get into. And also having enough variation, so the quality of the images that you show it. So there is an inherently aesthetic issue here as well that also delves into the politics of machine vision and the problems that arise from that. Because even with the photographs that we show machines to be trained on, that's where photographs also have biases inherent in them, the way that they're cropped, the way that the tools that we use to photograph or record, and all of those things come with politics and attached to them. So an unbiased algorithm is like almost like it's impossible. But how can we unpick that? So if we play clip number 9, this is another example of a military vehicle that we were experimenting with, an armored vehicle that's deployed in protests around the world, from Chile and to Egypt. And by using images in the same way that you saw with a tank, here we've created a model of this vehicle. It's called Sherpa. It's by a subsidiary of Volvo. And then we developed an interface through a game engine, whereby a user can use controllers to generate infinite variations of the object of interest. So you should be seeing now how through those controls, we can start rendering photorealistic images with variations in component configuration, dirt, scratches, patterns, on the object, around the object, even the way that it's photographed, camera lenses, angles, distance from the object. And in this way, we can very quickly generate tens of thousands of data sets that are readily available. And more importantly as well, it cuts the time for sort of searching for enough images if there's not enough available. But also, if you'll see at the very end of the clip, when it fades to kind of a stencil, what that stencil is, which highlights the object. And if it's finished, we can go back to the presentation. So if we come back to the presentation, yes, great. So essentially, what those stencils at the end allow to do is to detect where that object is in the image itself. So with 3D models, we're also able to automatically label, so a human doesn't have to go through each and every image, label where that object is and prepare the data set ready for the algorithm to train. So it was about optimizing as well to find the best way to generate large data sets. And this is something that we carried on into another investigation that we did into tear gas canisters. So if you play clip number 10, you'll see we developed these variables to parametricize also how we generate synthetic imagery for the triple chaser, which was a type of canister produced by the Safariland company. This was a company owned by Warren Kanders, who was a board member that has resigned since from the Board of Trustees at the Whitney Museum in New York. And during the Whitney Biennial, we submitted this investigation, an investigation prior to the visuals that you're seeing now, that investigated the use of this specific tear gas canister around the world, and obviously constituted a human rights violation. And artists through Decolonize the Space and other groups of artists on the site eventually pressured Kanders to resign in that context because of his links, obviously, to what is termed by the company as less lethal weapons. And so how we, if we come back to the presentation, the context of the production of these imagery with these images that you saw, you can also place the objects in kind of like photorealistic environments. We conducted studies on materiality and texturing in order to allow that to have that variability that you saw with parameters around scratching. And also decals or labeling essentially for the surfaces with all the labels that are available from the research. This is another, so if we play video number 11, which should be a shorter version, but this is a more recent research that we conducted into another kind of projectile in the Hong Kong pro-democracy protest, and the specific one allegedly produced by Chinese manufacturer Norinco. Obviously, this was had great implications and ongoing as well at the moment with the situation in Hong Kong and the dispersal of protests with these weapons by police. So this is also part of ongoing research in how we can create data sets and train machines to find and detect these objects of violence, essentially in the overabundance of footage online, which is it's impossible to get a researcher to go through so much footage that's generated, especially when, like in the context of places like Hong Kong, you've got live feeds that generate just hours and hours of footage. But what you've probably noticed, and I didn't address yet, but I will come to presently, is the fact that there's some very strange and aesthetically jarring images that are produced, almost psychedelic. And one may ask, what is the purpose of these when it is unlikely to see weapons or these kind of objects of violence that we're using in kind of such with garish backgrounds like these or colorful patterns. And indeed, it is a strange region of like what machine vision finds actually quite useful, which is creating enough noise and enough variability sometimes also means stretching it to an extreme extent where the object can be obfuscated, but the machine can then start learning from more delicate features of where it is. So if I go back to the anecdote about the kid and the apple, if I showed then a child an apple that's kind of like covered in funky shapes or is like has a weird background behind it, even though it's unlikely for the child to ever experience that in the real world, if it's trained or learned very well to recognize what an apple is, it should be able to recognize the finer features of an apple there. So essentially what these do is that they allow the machine to focus on these more fine features, and it forces it to distill them. And if we essentially what we're supplementing, to tie it back into the themes that we were mentioning earlier, if we're supplementing our spectrum of points of views with points that are synthetic or points of interpolated realities, if you will, with these synthetic versions of an object, we are creating seriality essentially, with combinations of values that alter the appearance of our object of interest, almost as if we have a genealogy by type of object, where it can mutate into countless of controlled parametric permutations. And it goes from expected subtle variations to gradual, more apparent changes, to versions that with deformities at the very boundary of how the object is expected to be deformed, drawing from photographs as reference when we were modeling and accounting for these parameters, down to what I was just highlighting earlier, a multiverse essentially of oddities, of object versions with strange and unlike possibilities. And although seemingly bizarre, these oddities push the boundary of the classifier's detection capabilities and add extreme variations to the data set that affects the qualitative side of things that I mentioned earlier. So remember, bigger and also more varied. So this is part of the more varied. Some of the images don't have to necessarily represent reality, because this is what we discovered, and it's very much an experimental process through also other research papers that have been coming out online from the machine learning community, that indeed, especially with training self-driving cars, you will find, by adding kind of these patterns, or like by creating these kind of like strange instances of kind of what we think should be a photoreal representation of an object, actually proved that the machine, for one reason or another, was becoming better at detecting the object of interest, even though you were supplementing the data set with some of these really garish and strange images. So what this shows is like a potentially maybe questionable or dangerous part of machine classification, when machine vision improves on like requiring kind of like extreme instances or aesthetically extreme imagery that might not necessarily represent reality, but we still see that it improves its performance. And this is a region that like we're constantly testing, but you see how essentially that allows through our ability to control the object in its 3D environment. This way we can understand a bit better how things like ambient occlusion, things like camera lenses, things like lighting, noise created by patterns and objects. In this case, these were chlorine cylinders that were used in the Syrian conflict. And this is the M4000 bombs that were in another investigation of ours, allegedly dropped by Russia in Syria. What's crucial here is that by pushing these boundaries, we can understand how those conditions, those finer conditions, affect the way a machine learns. And it essentially becomes only, just so you can understand how complex and how difficult it is to discuss and open up the black box. It's like chipping away only at the tip of the iceberg of understanding how all these computations basically communicate patterns and make correlations. Like, it's still a very open kind of like field for investigation, but it highlights more importantly the danger for abuse, like I said earlier about causation, when like obviously these classifiers are being used by corporations, state agents, etc. So we looked at bias, or I hope you understood some connection between bias and machine vision, and how we can start investigating that and investigating the tool, especially in our need to classify objects in vast data sets to mitigate the problematics. But now I'd like us to shift our focus on another case of human bias in human vision, and specifically in the space of the split second. So in the last case that I'd like to show you, we investigated the shooting of Harith Augustus, an African-American man in Chicago in July 2018, after what was meant to be a routine stop and search operation escalated by the police officers into his fatal shooting. Harith was carrying a gun, but in a state where conceal and carry is legal. So if we could please, so sorry, just a minute, before we play the clip, just a moment, sorry, before we play the clip. Yeah, sorry. Here are, what you're about to hear are two reactions in the aftermath of the event that highlight the need to look, but also the difficulty of seeing the images and videos that I'm about to show you. One of them is it was released on July 14th, the day of the incident, by Will Calloway, who was a community activist. He held a press conference outside the Chicago PD's headquarters, and he demanded for footage to be released. So the need to see all available evidence on one hand. And the other, you'll listen to Audrey Petty, a poet and critic who lives in the South Shore of Chicago, and she explained how there's also a paradox where there's a challenge to seeing all this, like the repetition of kind of bodies, and especially Black bodies, being killed in the media again and again, and whether in questioning whether there is a need to again have to impose our viewing to that kind of violence. So if we could play the clip and listen to them.
Today, I did file the Freedom of Information Act with my attorney, and we are demanding that the Chicago Police Department release all body cam, dash cam, and surveillance footage of that shooting. We're so tired. We're tired of community violence, and we're tired of police violence. We don't trust what they say. We do not trust what Chicago Police Department say. Show us. Don't wait 60 days. Show us now. Show the community now. Show us what you all see. We want to see what you see. Show us that it was justified. And we want that footage to be released immediately for true transparency purposes. We don't want to wait.
It wasn't even a decision that I announced to anyone, but at a certain point I knew I couldn't watch Black men being murdered. Like, I knew I will be responsible, and I will learn the things that I can learn and be informed, but I reached a point where I just could not do it. I think at that same moment I was trying to learn as much about him as I could. It wasn't a turning away, it was really going towards certain things, and I was on Twitter and I was listening to people's accounts, and I was listening to people who were at the demonstration, and I was trying to learn about him. But when it was released, it was not the thing I wanted to access. I wonder if seeing the video may in some way, just processing that, may leave less room for other things that I think are important to do, to really dwell with him and to dwell with that event.
Great. So just before we play the next clip, Eddie Johnson, the Chicago PD Superintendent of Police, a day after the event, on July 15th, spoke at a press conference. And here you'll see him speak now in clip number 13.
Decision to use lethal force is made in a split second, and it's based on the safety of the officer and also that surrounding communities. We're not trying to hide anything. We're not trying to fluff anything. The video speaks for itself.
So from what he said, images and videos, though, don't speak for themselves, especially a video without sound, as you're about to see. So what I'm going to show you next, and I'm going to choose to obviously show you the videos, of course, but the issue about seeing and not seeing we'll return to at the end. Just before we play the next video, what you'll see is the video that the police, the Chicago PD released initially. And this is from body cam footage. The body cams were also at the time quite a recent technology being used by police officers. So the video you'll see is from the perspective of the police. It's an edited, there's an edited and an unedited version. We'll show you the edited version first, so you see also how the police presented the video, because essentially if you look out in the video, it will freeze at the moment that the video at the moment of the video wants to zoom in and freeze on when Augustus's gun is revealed, when his shirt gets lifted, and you'll and then we could discuss that. So if we can play, yes, number 14. Great. So back to the presentation. Notice how also the police, when they released this video, it was titled "Aggravated Assault to a Police Officer." So the language and how the narrative is constructed as well is super important. And our investigation was structured as 6 durations of the split second, because like Eddie Johnson said in his video, it all boils down to split second decisions. But this is somehow like discussed as an indivisible unit of time. And we wanted to consider escalation as one of, and the events that led to the split second as an important element of how things unfolded within that split second, and that it shouldn't be indivisible and not considered in isolation. So we divided our investigation in years, days, hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. And today I'll focus on like part of the analysis, because it's quite a lengthy analysis. Body-worn cameras are important to understand as a tool first. And as you can see, the officers in this CCTV camera, you can see where these cameras are located, and the 2 officers on the left-hand side, the one to the furthest left with the cap highlighted there, Dylan Halley, he's the officer, so you can see him here. He's the officer who shot, and the one next to him, Megan Fleming, was the officer who tried to apprehend Harith in the beginning and were responsible for the escalation. And it's important to highlight them as well, because they were the 2 officers in probation as well. So body-worn cameras that you see them wearing, they basically an Axon body cam 2 is the name of the camera itself. And these cameras, by sort of these Chicago PD's own directive, should be turned on when a officer considers that there's an incident that needs to be recorded. So in this incident, though, the cameras were only turned on. The first camera that turned on actually was the shooter's camera. So the camera that you saw from that clip, the edited clip, and the other was the first camera, and that was the shooter's camera that got turned on. When it gets turned on, though, it gets turned on only, he only turns it on after he fired the shots. And these cameras save, they buffer and they save the last 30 seconds before they were turned on, but without sound. So we have no audio until after. And this is really important, especially when you're trying to say that a video that sort of like what kind of elements that we don't know of what we couldn't listen to, you know, what was being said on the scene, what was being discussed. So only through testimony we could try and verify these and match them up to it. But essentially what's important to understand here as well is that the camera played an important role in giving us insight, but even though the Chicago PD considered that this is enough, you know, this is case closed, it's clear, the camera shows the assailant running, holding a gun, that was enough to justify everything about the event. But I don't know what, from also you as an audience now seeing that video, I don't know how much of this we understand at the moment, beyond what we're about to delve into with kind of the wider constellation of things that happened around it. So if we play the next clip, this is the unedited version, and we'll listen to the audio for a bit.
Police shot. Shots fired at the police. Or police officer. Shoot.
Okay, we could stop it there. So police shots fired at the police. So this is the moment that we have sound, is the moment the construction of the narrative from the perspective of the police already begins. Shots fired at the police, says Dylan Halley. The perspectival bias is not only something that we all inherently bring as baggage to any form of media we consume, it's also two-way. The media taints our perception of its content. So imagine someone watching this footage, the first thing you hear also being reported is exactly what the following quote wants to bring to light: the fact that video recordings don't actually show the truth of an interaction. They are inherently indeterminate. Video will reflect a different reality depending not only on who is watching, but also on who is recording. And in our case, Dylan Halley's body cam at the moment when he decides to turn it on and decides what to say. If video adheres too closely to the officer's point of view, as in body camera video, it may provide a small but appreciable advantage to the police. This was Karen Myers in a research essay titled Body Camera Obscura, the Semiotics of Police Video. So in its framing of the incident, watching through the lens of the shooter's camera, we psychologically identify, even subconsciously, with the perspective of the shooter. And indeed, the shooter not only shoots Augustus with his gun, but also he's shooting him with his lens. And in doing so, creates automatically an otherness. His point of view already sets the target as the other. Augustus is very representation, his identity, his blackness, his gamified criminalizing in first-person shooter video vision has him trapped within the narrative frame of a very specific agent, being the police officer that's conducting what you feel is watching it as a chase. So there's issues here of embodiment and bias as well once the pieces of media get circulated. So in order to start unpacking all of this and to go into like these the issues, like we showed before, we place all of the available cameras in our 3D model and on a timeline, and we synchronize them with the available metadata. And some of the CCTV footage, even in the Zach case as well, people also don't time code their CCTVs, are often wrong, the time code on them. So we often find ourselves trying to find other ways of establishing synchronization. Even mobile phones, the footage that was shot in the Zach case earlier as well, I didn't mention, was shot off a mobile phone and its metadata was wrong as well. So metadata being the information that can be extracted from a clip. Sometimes you have data hidden in clips of footage if you have the original, and these allow you to access time codes, etc. But a lot of times we don't have this, or the footage is damaged, or it's not in its original form. That's just part of like the method, but also considering that we did the same here, and the gaps in time here were much more granular. Here we wanted to dive into the split-second moment, but again we're presented with, you know, even down to all this available kind of information that you just saw, we can't go into the split second because we are down to footage which is down to frame rate. And the frame between frame there 5 minutes 30 and 34 and then 35, there you've got like a frame in which we can't access. So the milliseconds are also inaccessible to an investigator, and that's where a split second decision happens. So since we are working from video footage, our smallest unit of recorded time becomes the frame, and there are two types of cameras at different frame rates: the CCTV footage and the body-worn cameras. And the CCTV footage shoots at 25 frames per second, so there's more of a gap there in terms of analyzing milliseconds, whereas the body-worn cameras shoot at 30 frames per second. And here the long duration, the base fragment of time that can't be accessed like down in the millisecond, like we expand the duration in order to investigate it. So with the help of a neuroscientist, we estimated reaction times. The neuroscientist, Tiago Branco, you'll listen to him later on in another clip. He speaks about reaction times, and he specializes in that in his lab at UCL Research Center, University College London. So we work closely with him in order to look at like what it takes for an officer in a situation like that to react to different stimuli. So the time from a simple stimulus to an action is about 300 milliseconds. And if we work backwards, where you see on the left-hand side in the timeline here, this the red line, that's the moment of the first shot. And if we work backwards from the first shot to there's 50 milliseconds up to the point that it takes for a finger to pull the trigger. It would take another 15 milliseconds, moving further backwards, for a command to travel from the brain to the muscles to pull the trigger. And it will take 100 milliseconds then for the decision for the process, the decision to shoot, to process the decision to fire. And 400 milliseconds then, between 100 and 400 milliseconds to pass and understand visual information. So before Halley decided to send that information to his finger to shoot. So when Halley started the process of shooting, Augustus was somewhere between the beginning and the end of that yellow highlighted zone. So you can see it highlighted there in the footage as well. But this is only if we're treating the split second as well, like in isolation, as if like everything, this is still from the perspective of the police narrative and even the legal framework that later these tend to go to court. And with a lot of these cases where these shootings happen, like it comes, and especially like within the context of, this is important to mention as well, within the context of a lot of these cases that have been happening over the years, especially in the case of like the killings of black men and women in America, and in the context of the Black Lives protest, eventually the question that's asked is a question around reasonableness in the legal context. And reasonableness is the reason, like how reasonable the judgment of the police officer is deemed in the events that led him to decide to conduct the way that he did or she did. But the split second as well is invoked as an extra kind of like legal terminology, where within it and within that isolation, within what we're seeing now, these several frames of footage, it's like invoked by the officers as justifying that in isolation only. And if in that split moment, if we can pause and see that frame can somehow justify a threat, then it cancels out anything outside of the split second, which is part of the problematic that this case wanted to highlight. So going on to the kind of gaps in space that we mentioned before, we use the 3D model this time in a much more nuanced sense to place the footage, because we had the body cam footage in such detail. So if we play the clip number 16, what you see is when we place the footage in the model, we accounted for the lens distortion. So you see the footage being undistorted and the errors in it. So if you could pause the clip there, just at when it undistorts from the lens, yes. So at that moment, when what we highlight is the fact that in the body cams as well, you notice that there's a kind of fisheye lens going on, and that exaggerates the movement. So the exaggerated movement also makes the target, be it the victim or even the other objects moving within the footage, have more exaggerated movements, and therefore someone might even infer movements as being more violent because they get exaggerated at the edges because of the distortion. So if we play again, we continue playing. Once doing that, we then also motion track those cameras in space. So you see the camera moving as well with that yellow line. We essentially motion track every frame in the 3D model, and then we have access to that in 3D. And by placing 3D figures in the model, that's the figure of Megan Fleming, one of the officers, we're able to rig the 3D figure like a puppet and use, like I referred to the chessboard of tiles on the street in the Zat case, as a moment to get the prints to kind of like position also and verify the location of their feet in their movement of the officer, and then cross-verify all those movements through all the other cameras, the CCTV and the other body cameras, as you can see now in the footage probably at some point, sorry I can't see it, where we're flying into all the different cameras. And we did this for every frame and every other officer, and the dynamic model that results allows us to interrogate the event from different perspectives and speeds and map out the contours of the event's choreography, essentially. And this, great, and this synthesizing of evidence allows us the drawing of the narrative thread, again, between the gaps in our vision, because we're able to have this kind of commons in which we can understand the relationships between the fragments of evidence. And this, what you saw there was essentially the several seconds, I think it was around 8 seconds, that this little clip spans from until the 5th shot that gets fired. This, we spent collectively among us in the team around 300 hours, painstakingly going frame by frame in each of the cameras, analyzing the movement of each officer in order to provide this kind of like synthetic simulation of all the officers in the scene and the escalation that led to the 5 shots. And what we're able to see as well is to kind of go to this point of escalation is that essentially the officers saw Augustus and they saw kind of him carrying a gun and wanted to conduct a stop and search so they can see whether he had a license. So he was there in the footage. We see only very shortly before, in the 30 seconds that Dylan allowed us from the buffering, Augustus cooperating with the officer and preparing to show identification. But before he even gets to that, though, this is the first legal zone that we're in. So this is why it's important to understand escalation in how the bodies were pushed into a legal zone of the split second where the shooting was inevitable according to the police, but it wasn't, because the first zone was the stop and search, and the routine wasn't allowed to be conducted, because there you see Megan Fleming approaching Augustus from behind as he's facing the other officer in front of him. You can see at the end of the frame there, and in the plan view from our simulation, you can see the officer standing in front. As he's preparing to show identification, she approaches from behind to reach and grab him. So suddenly the stop and search operation pushes us into another legal zone. Suddenly, according to the police's perspective, now Harith is resisting arrest. And as he's resisting arrest and he's being grabbed by the officers, Megan Fleming is grabbing his t-shirt, and we've even created a simulation of the fabric of the t-shirt up until the moment we could verify that it was being grabbed and then released. What this moment, the moment of release and him trying to resist the grab, suddenly moves into another legal space, which is of aggravated assault on an officer, and which was what the video was. Remember, the title of the video was. So these were also titles that the police officers sort of changed in their reports as the narrative unfolded according to their perspective. And finally, when we reach this moment where Augustus gets blocked by another police vehicle as he's fleeing, and in that moment his hand is it was approaching the holster of his gun. That's when we're now into the fourth legal zone, where the split second comes into play, and where the police justifies this is enough to make this armed confrontation and a threat to the officer's life for Dylan Halley to then shoot Harith. But because this relies on the split second in isolation, these 4 legal zones that I just went through are completely discounted then. Immediately, it's this moment that is frozen in time and used indivisibly to judge the officer's response. So this is when we're able to unlock these other perspectives and to have an overview perspective. So if we play clip number 17, in this clip, we analyzed the succession of actions and reactions and opened up the view of the choreography of the figures. And we're able for the first time to compare the behaviors of the police escalating of each and every police officer as well, comparatively to each other, to see who was escalating and who was also keeping a distance. When 3 of the officers corner Augustus, and then we can shift the perspective and we can understand when the shooter, where the shooter was. You also see, I think, in the clip, you'll see a moment where we shift perspective and we see the point of view of the body-worn camera when the gun reveals itself under the t-shirt. But if we also shift perspective to see from Augustus's point of view, the moment Halley has his gun raised as well. So by constantly being able to shift perspectives, we're able to we're able to do what Benjamin Wallace Wells described in an article in the New Yorker around police shootings, race, and fear, and the fear defense. Benjamin says we need to often rewind the imaginary tape and shift the focus away from the moment when shots are fired and towards all the decisions that led to that point, all that escalation that I just referred to. So before we play the next clip, what you're about to see now is precisely that comparative. So we saw the overview perspective, almost this God-eye view that we're able to do as investigators. But in the next clip, just before we play it, the comparative perspective is something that we did by isolating each officer in an elevation, in an architectural elevation, to show you figure by figure how we can analyze behaviors comparatively. And this is important to show the other arguments around reasonableness, and reasonableness, because reasonableness in the legal framework in the US rests heavily on the reasoning of the police officer. By doing this comparative analysis that you're about to see, we can gauge the reasonableness of Halley compared to the reasonableness of each other officer, especially the chief officers in the case that were on the scene, who the chief officer was the one who was conducting the stop and search initially, who didn't raise their guns and were much more careful. And this kind of shows how, by looking at that kind of collective behavior of each officer, that maybe some of the officers, if only one of them shot, that this might have been unreasonable if the others didn't consider doing the same. So if we can play the clip now with audio, you'll listen to the neuroscientist Tiago Branco. Clip 18, yes.
That's the most interesting thing about this whole scene here, is that you have 5 policemen and only one of them shoots, and all of them have very, very, very similar sensory input, right? And the only thing that differs is experience. Their brains are seeing exactly the same information, but they result in different actions because they're interpreting their information differently, or because their threshold for implementing certain actions is different.
Right, so there you listen to Tiago explaining sort of the biases and how they feed into the behavior of the policemen. But essentially, what's also important to highlight is Megan and Dylan being the chief escalators. Well, not only the 2 white officers, but also were the only two officers there that were on probation at the time. So this puts a lot of things into question about escalation. And the next, before I go into the next clip, what we're about to see in a moment is the missing dash cam. So even though Eddie Johnson, the the chief at the press conference that you saw in the beginning claimed that all footage was released and was made available, they actually omitted a dash cam clip that was inside one of the police vehicles that was parked there, the white vehicle that we see at the side of the officer parked in front of where the incident happened. And that dash cam was recording. And we noticed through the documents that we were going through and through our research that this clip was missing when we were identifying all the cameras. So through a Freedom of Information request, we managed to have the dash cam footage released. Before we play the clip, again, just to caveat what's about to be seen, this is really important because it reverses the point of view for the first time. All the other points of view that we had so far in this investigation and what you've seen is CCTV, which is quite distant, and a point of view from always that gamified kind of first-person shooter of the body cam. And this counter perspective of the dash cam is seminal because of what you're about to see. So if we play clip number 19, please. So by flipping the perspective onto Dylan, and for the first time seeing the shooter from outside of his own body camera, this completely changes also the perception. Had this footage been released at the same time as the body cam footage, it could have significantly altered public perception of the event, which, according to the police at the time and a lot of the reports in kind of like daily programs and like news reports even on news channels at the time, they would report this as like almost a closed and clean case. It was very clear and evident why this man was shot. He was carrying a gun, he was considered a threat, and he was gunned down. But this is kind of the things that sometimes perspectival bias makes it so much more like that extra degree easier to be convinced of like certain narratives, and hence its withholding was useful for the police in presenting the event only from the point of view of the officer. So Augustus's POV, his point of view, is also something that's often not considered in these kind of situations. And what's important with this, so what you see here is the point of view is play, and you're about to see it in a clip as well, is placing, just before we play it though, is placing a camera, the similar Axon camera though, but on Augustus to simulate what he might have been seeing in the clip. So if we play the clip now, you'll see first in real time and then played back slower, we're able to establish a counter perspective, and by doing so reverse the gaze from the police body cam that is probing Augustus and makes him a target, criminalizes him, puts him in the line of fire, not only of the gun but also the metaphorical one of the camera, to stare back against the agents, the police figures, or the agents who are like shooting or directing the narrative. And we can see the moment when Megan comes from behind to apprehend Augustus, and even moments, simulations of the moments where the guns are raised. So this is of course not to say that this is kind of like evident, like as an evidentiary piece, accurate. No one can ever simulate like human vision and what it could be. But this is to open up the conversation about not only points of view, but also perspectival bias, and to make considerations for when we are so used to always coming at an event from all sides, but from the center of that object or the target or the victim. And by doing this, because we were able to simulate the figures and their positions, we can also show this and appreciate the thread and the perspective, the threats from the perspective of the victim as well. So finally, in clip number 21, just before we play it, you'll listen to Tiago sort of like concluding on issues of like a bias playing into neurology and how we behave and how we react. So if we can play the clip, number 21. Thank you.
Sensory evidence goes from the eye to whatever makes a decision and implements an action. If there's only 200 milliseconds to do this, there's only so many parts of the brain that can be involved. And most of the times, this process goes via what we call subcortical structures, which are more ancient structures in the brain, actually dealing with survival. So the regions in the brain that are very active when you're under threat bypass these more evolved areas and make very fast decisions. And that's a good thing in some situations. But that leads to a lot of biases and leads to errors.
So police officers are trained to supposedly create time and de-escalate a situation. And were these directives applied here, which they clearly were not, Augustus might have still been alive. And those errors of judgment that essentially Tiago also highlighted there in the end, that misinformation or misunderstanding even of an event, even while it's happening, even when someone might misinformed or whether intentionally or not, the police that Zach was a robber, say before things happened, or for example that all these errors in judgment, all these things that drive a narrative a certain way, these are happening at the very moment of an event, and they could be fatal, obviously, and as we have seen, and the actions that follow as a consequence is precisely what Tiago referred to as the short-circuiting of the mental process that occurs in interpreting an event, whether by the victim, the shooter, the investigator, or me as a researcher, or you as an audience watching all of these bits of information. We're constantly mediating between available points of view, and those gaps left between the transitory instances of all those points are points that without analysis remain without depth. And what our methods envisage to provide is precisely that depth by entering the space between a space of politics beyond the detectable thresholds of the tools, of the recorded footage, of the testimonies, and provide sight where we struggle to see, or indeed interrogate the mechanisms of sight itself. And that finally, in the context of representing the tug of war between what Calloway and Audrey Petty mentioned about the struggle between the need to look but the difficulty to show, at the Chicago Biannual, when we presented our investigation on the shooting of Harith Augustus, we presented it without any footage, without any of our videos. It was essentially a black room devoid of the videos and only with text. Instead, we displayed the videos on a different site with the offices of our collaborators, the Invisible Institute, and this allowed viewers the consent to then travel to the Invisible Institute to watch the videos and instead appreciate the investigation through the text, and also us highlighting that kind of conflict between the need to show, but sometimes also the difficulty in seeing. And finally, sort of to wrap up this this kind of conversation, or maybe to open up indeed the conversation in like the Q&A that might follow around like trying to expand points of view, and like in a world that is so heavily mediated and where we're saturated by what even Paul Virilio calls the information bomb that we're going through, is a quote by is Walter Benjamin quoting Moholy Nagy, the Hungarian artist from the Bauhaus, saying that the illiterates of the future will be those unable to decipher a photograph, not writing. Thank you.
On my microphone. So hi, thanks for this.
Thank you so much.
Super interesting talk.
Yeah.
We also have people like clapping in the background.
And we are really looking forward to the Zoom after talk and the Q&A, and we're gonna make it at
45, so in 20 minutes. And we're gonna send another Zoom invitation to you and all of you visitors. Thanks again. I'm super excited for the after talk.